Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Nazia Sajwal. I have with us today the wonderful pleasure of introducing Professor Jennifer Petriglieri, Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at INSEAD. She has a PhD at INSEAD and an MBA from IMD Switzerland. Has many years of research that she'll be sharing with us today on the topic of leading between the lines. So let me hand over now to Jennifer. Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks, Nazia. Morning, everyone. Good afternoon. It's good to be with you, and I'm particularly excited to present this because last week I spent the week in Boston where I was leading a conference where we were talking exactly about these ideas. So this is like hot off the press. I've not shared it with anyone else before, so you're the first audience, so that's great. So I'm a professor at INSEAD, and my research focuses on leadership and more specifically leadership development. And I work with a lot of big organizations, really looking at their culture of leadership in the organizations. And today I'm going to be talking about a dilemma organizations have had for many, many centuries, which is how do we balance instrumental aims, right? The need to get stuff done efficiently with humanistic aims, which is how do we grow, develop people and connect across differences. Now, you don't need me to tell you that these two things are interconnected. If we're very good at one, it's probably because we're very good at the other. And if we're struggling with one, it's probably because we're struggling with the other. But you also don't need me to tell you that at the moment, the balance is really tipped in favor of instrumental aims. So whether we look at the societal level, whether we look in for-profit, not-for-profit organizations, governmental organizations, we're very focused on the kind of efficiency and getting stuff done. And the focus on the kind of humanistic aims is really falling away. And we can see this at all levels in society by two dynamics, which is polarization and alienation. Now, polarization, you know, as well as I do, is a word that's being bandied around a lot at the moment, and particularly at the societal level and the political level, we talk about polarization. And in my mind, we talk about it a little bit too much without understanding what it is. So first, I want to double click and what really is polarization? And what does it do to us? And what does it do within our organizations? So what happens in polarization is there are two groups which stand in opposition to each other. And when we have two groups which define each self in opposition, there's two psychological mechanisms going on. One is disidentification. What does that mean? It's a fancy word to say that I define myself as not you. So it's not simply that I ignore the other group, I'm not bothered about the other group. I actually define myself as I'm not an X, whatever that group is. The second piece is moralization. So doubling down on this, I'm not like you. I then say, and you are bad, evil, wrong. You know, we can insert the words we like. And of course, like many things in life, it takes two to tango, right? Because when these dynamics take seed, what we see is the groups move further and further away from each other and moralize each other more and more, and are more likely to disidentify with each other. Now, of course, we see this happening at the societal level, but it's also starting to happen in organizations themselves. And we can see this linked to a couple of different trends in organizations. Because what happens when polarization takes root is people start to feel very alienated, whichever side of the pole they're on. And we see this in the rise of things like loneliness in the workplace, which is something that I've just completed a big research project on, looking at the rise of loneliness in the workplace. We also see it among kind of stress and mental health and burnout, and these rates have rocketed in the last 10 years. So as leaders, these dynamics cause really big problems for our ability to get the job done and to balance these two sides of the equations. And I think the tendency as leaders is to think, well, the problem is out there. The problem is political. It's kind of big P political out in the world. But we're seeing more and more these problems within organizations. And of course, the reasons is that our organizations are becoming more and more heterogeneous. And so there's more and more different groups which we identify people by. Now, whether that is a visible grouping, gender, race, nationality, ethnicity, or whether it's a less visible grouping, things like what background are you from, what's your training, are you an engineer or a marketing person? So in business schools, we often say, are you a poet or a quant? These are all lines along which polarization happens. Now, as leaders, we can look at these dynamics and think, my goodness, polarization is a group level dynamic. It's not an individual level dynamic. How on earth can I, as an individual leader, think about affecting this dynamic, which is having all of these negative effects on organizations and on our society as a self? And to really get into understanding how we as individuals can affect these issues of polarization, I think we need to get past these psychological mechanisms and start thinking about what is happening at the emotional and cognitive level. And essentially what is happening when we are in a group that is part of a polarization dynamic is dehumanization. So when we are on the journey to polarization, or whether we're really at one of those poles, but even as we start on that journey, what we do is we start to lose our ability to see the other as fully human, right? As having exactly the same concerns, the same wishes, the same goals as ourselves. Now, I think sort of intellectually, we can all probably know that, we all humans have this core fundamental things that they want. We all want to be safe. We all want opportunities. We all struggle with our teenage children. We all worry about our parents. We all want to ensure that we can get to a better place and better ourselves. But when we're in this dynamic of polarization, we lose that aspect very, very quickly. And we see the other as sort of bad, evil, morally wrong, someone who's not like us, and someone who, and I hear this a lot, I just don't get them. I don't understand them. And this is really a litmus test of knowing that polarization is happening. And so INSEAD, you probably know, has 3 campuses. So here in Fontainebleau, Singapore, and also Abu Dhabi. Now, in early December, the faculty all got together for a retreat in Abu Dhabi. And the day before the faculty retreat, I led a separate day for the organizational behavior faculty, where we had a retreat at somewhere called the Abrahamic family house. Now, if you are ever in Abu Dhabi, first of all, go there. It's this amazing place, but I want to tell you a little bit about it. So this is the Abrahamic family house. It's built by a very famous Ghanaian architect who's, embarrassingly, his name has just escaped me. But it's a huge site on which there is a mosque, a synagogue, and a church. And they're all built, the mosque is the central one, the church is on the left, and the synagogue is on the right. And they're all built on exactly the same footprint. So they're these 3 kind of cube structures. And you can, of course, do a tour of these 3 buildings, but underneath is a site for interfaith dialogue. And as part of this site, there's an exhibition center. And it's fascinating to go into this exhibition center. So you walk into this very dark room and they project things onto the wall. And what they project are little snippets from the scriptures of the 3 religions, but they project them without telling you which scripture they're from. And of course, you can imagine what happens. You read one, you're like, oh, I recognize that. And then, of course, it's from a book that is not part of your faith. Likewise, they project images from the rituals, the family meals from all of the different faiths. And you see them, oh, I recognize that. And then, of course, it's not from your faith. And what's really striking about this, and what we did as a group of faculty afterwards, was really have this discussion around how can we get people to have this experience outside of going to the Abrahamic family house, right? How can we get them to have this experience of rooting back to the core humanity, which doesn't mean we ignore the differences, but it means our connections lead with the commonality as opposed to leading with the differences. And of course, that is what is the magic sauce in organizations. And that is what, if we could do it at society level, would be the magic sauce at the society level. So I want to start by sharing a study which is particularly insightful into this question. And this is a study in the top academic journal in the field, Administrative Science Quarterly. It's very heady, so I'm going to summarize it very quickly. It essentially finds that the heterosexual men who are least biased towards women in the workplace, who are most likely to support them, are those whose partners, whose wives are professional women. And there's been later studies that shows this also holds true for men who have adult daughters who are professional women. Now, what's going on here is exactly this dynamic of humanization. You know, when I walk through life next to someone, I really get the privilege of truly understanding their ambitions, their struggles, their gifts. And then when I meet someone like them, I'm much better at taking them in as fully human and at connecting to them on this kind of universal level, which still acknowledges the difference, but they don't lead the interaction. So on the one hand, this finding is great, right? It tells us the mechanism, it tells us what we need to do. But at the same time, I'm sure you can see the problem with this, right? Most of us only have one life partner at any one time. And most of us have that life partner for a long time, which is usually a good thing. But does that mean we can only connect to people who are like our life partner, who we walk through life with, or like our adult children? Well, hopefully not, right? Otherwise, I would only ever to be able to connect with Sicilian men, which I hope I can connect with more than Sicilian men. And the reality is organizations have spent billions and do spend billions every single year trying to find other ways of getting these same effects, right? How do we get the effect of being really close to someone and understanding their lives, even if we don't have someone like that in our life? And the problem is most of these interventions have failed, and they've not only failed, but many of them have actually had the opposite effects. And that's because most of the interventions we've designed are essentially cheap tricks, right? I'm going to give you a 2-hour session on implicit bias and hope that for the rest of your life, for the rest of your career, you are never going to be biased towards anyone you meet from any group that you've never met before. I mean, when you put it like that, it's absolutely ridiculous. And this is one of those interventions that we know actually makes things worse. It doesn't make things better. And the reason is it's actually very difficult to take other people's perspective. So there's decades of research on perspective taking. And what we learn from that research is it's very easy to momentarily get someone to take someone else's perspective, to do a little intervention, hey, I get it, but it just doesn't last. There's no longevity to these effects. So it's a pretty high bar to be able to consistently take the perspective of another unless we're kind of reminded of it all the time. So I want to talk about a way today that is very well proven to do this, incredibly cheap. And it's through reading works of fiction. Now, I'm going to start by appealing to those of you who have your little scientific mind. Okay. So I forgot to flick the slides. So there's a very long history of research on this. And this is just a handful of studies that were published in the last couple of months that really show that reading fiction is very proven over the long term to humanize the other and to keep us carrying that effect with us over time. Now, these studies are kind of boring to read if you're not an academic. And they essentially say what novelists and literary minds have been, saying to us for hundreds of years. So instead, I'm going to put some quotes up from some authors which you maybe know, but I'm going to focus on a couple of ones. So reading fiction is a vital means of imagining a life other than our own, which in turn makes us more empathetic beings. And this is very, very strongly proven in the data. there's a huge link between empathy and reading fiction, and particularly empathy towards others who are sort of not like us, who are from a group who we may be likely to polarize if we don't feel close to them. And I think the last quote from Isabel Allende is great, right? In fiction, you go into the thoughts of people, the little people, the people who were defeated, the poor, the women, the children, that are never in history books. Now, I think you can also go into the minds of the big people as well. And what's actually happening psychologically when we read fiction? There's two things happening. One is this dynamic of emotional transportation. And emotions are really important here. It's impossible to humanize another group just by cognition, by thought. So by someone like me sitting down and saying, well, this is what this group is like, this is how you should treat them. It just doesn't work. And the reason we need that emotional transportation is when, if you imagine the last fiction work you read, what happens when you're reading fiction is a couple of things. One is it lasts over time, right? Even if you're a fast reader like me, a book takes 4 or 5 hours to read over a couple of days or over a couple of weeks. And the key thing about fiction is character development. So they're taking you on a journey. So you're essentially going on a journey with a character. And the reason fiction works in a way that films do not work is films make us lazy, right? They feed us too much information. But in fiction, we have to imagine the world ourselves. And when we do that, we really get into that character's shoes in a way that film does slightly, but not to that depth of effect. So it's kind of good to make your brain work because we get these effects of humanization. So I guess this raised the question, well, what do you read, right? Does it matter what we read? Are some works of fiction better than others? What should we be advising people to read? And I'm going to put one class of fiction to one side, which is well known not to have this effect, which is murder mysteries. Now, I love a good murder mystery. I love a good Agatha Christie. But what we know very much about murder mystery books is they don't tend to develop characters. They're really about plot development, right? Who did it and where are the clues? Now, I'm not saying don't read crime fiction, don't read murder mystery. They're great fun on the beach, especially. But apart from that, really any other type of fiction works. So I'll tell you, I have a cousin, and well, I have many cousins, but one of my cousins, we really connect around reading. But he reads very different books from me, and he's really into sci-fi, which I'll be honest, is not my go-to genre. And for years, he's like, you've got to read some sci-fi, you've got to read some sci-fi. And in the end, I was like, oh God, just give me a recommendation, Adam. So he says, I'm going to send you a book. And I was like, oh, this is easy. And he sent me this book, and it was like, you know, when you get these books and that door stops, and it was, I don't know, 2,000 pages. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to read this 2,000 pages of sci-fi, of all these different worlds, and it's really not my bag. But it was essentially a story of an oppressed group of people who were fighting back against the oppressors. And, you know, I got so into it, I couldn't put it down. And I really learned a lot from that book around what do oppressed people do when they're losing, right? When things are just getting worse and worse and worse. So I guess this story is like, don't be limited. You can really read anything. But what we see are these fixed effects that last a long time over time. That said, I am going to give you some book recommendations. And when I was thinking of, so I'll have to say, I started off with this slide this weekend, and I showed it to my son, and there were 20 books on there. And he was like, that may be a little bit much, Mum, right? Let's pare back a bit. So what we did together is we picked the books that were about some of the groups. Some of the groups are groups that I find it hard to kind of connect to, I'll be honest. Others are groups that I think it would be great if as a society we got better connecting to. So here are the, and I can see some of you doing book recommendations. Throw them in the chat. I always love a good book recommendation. So the first group that I think many of us other at the moment are the tech bros, right? So the Elon Musks, the guys who, and they pretty much are all guys, who are kind of running these big organizations that have this outsized influence on our lives. So here's a book, The Candy House. For those of you who've read it, it's a great book that I was quite reluctant to read, I'll be honest. But one of my colleagues said, you have to read this book. You're really going to understand the psychology of tech bros. And it's about one of these tech bros who's made, a lot of money, sold his company. What does he do next? And he stumbles across this new idea. It's quite dystopian, but it's really good to get into the minds of these very bright, very ambitious people and to try and sort of understand them from a different perspective. So this is my first recommendation. My second recommendation is actually written by Victoria Lloyd Barlow, who is on the autistic spectrum. And this book, which was recommended for the Booker Prize, actually, it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, I think 2 years ago, is absolutely fascinating for those of you who are not neurodivergent, probably fascinating for those of you who are as well, because the narrator of the book is someone who has autism. So she writes in the first person, and her central character is someone who has autism. And it's about her internal dialogue and how she kind of tries to understand what people mean when they talk to her and how she reads between the lines. Absolutely brilliant book, really well written. And I was just amazed by what I had not understood about a topic that I thought I had understood, really seeing it through the eyes of this neurodivergent character. The next one, I was just talking to Nazia earlier. I was like, you have to read this book. This is a very slim book, so you can read this in 2 hours. So this is a really good one. But this is set in London, in the UK, and it's really about race and class. Seen through the eyes of the central character is someone who's kind of lower class, not the dominant race. And it's just incredible to get into that character's shoes, into her shoes, and really see how she works in the city, right? Really see how she takes in some of the things which I'm sure me and some of you would think were everyday things. So it's really, you get into the world of this psychology. The next two are two of my absolute favorite books. So The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, now that you're going to learn a lot about my psychology, and Beneath the Wheel by Hermann Hesse. So these are both two works of fiction. Both Sylvia Plath and Hermann Hesse were people who struggled with mental illness. And they were also people who were wildly ambitious and wildly talented. And both of these books are kind of, semi-autobiographical. They are fictions, but they're semi-autobiographical. Incredible exposés of people who have, mental illness among the ambitious. And I'm sure you like me know there's a lot of people like that in our worlds, in the business world, in the organizational world. And the last book I'm going to recommend is what I think of as a popcorn fiction. It's super fun to read. This is not going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, but it's very fun. And I'm sure some of you have already read this book, which is Lessons in Chemistry. It's a super fun book. It's like a kind of beach book, really about women's struggle in the workplace. It's a hoot. You will cry laughing reading it. But these are just some little examples. But I want to stress that these are just some examples. You can read anything and it will get you there. And I think when I think about organizations, we very often turn to science. We very rarely turn to the arts to answer many of our problems. But if we think about some of those quotes I showed, so Albert Camus, who's obviously the famous French writer, would say, fiction is the best way to get to the truth. And I think that's very true when we think about organizational dynamics. So just returning to this kind of dynamic of polarization, we know that doing things like reading fiction can really humanize the other and walk us back from the brink of polarizing the other. I also want to say that, of course, in these dynamics of polarization, we all think we're the good guys, right? The other group are the problem. So I want to end with one final recommendation, which is a book I actually reread on the long plane journey to the US, which is The Portrait of Dorian Gray. So I'm going to describe the book really quickly, because what this book is an incredible story about how we are the problem. So I always talk about leadership in my classes as leadership is really about taking personal responsibility for what's happening around you. Now, it's very easy to interpret that as, okay, my responsibility as a leader is to do something about what's going on around me. Yes, that's a good start. But I also think our personal responsibility as leaders is to recognize how we are also part of the problem. And we always are part of the problem, even if we like to blame those guys over there. And The Portrait of Dorian Gray symbolically is exactly this. So it's the story of a young guy, a beautiful young guy in Regency London, who one summer meets the famous portrait taker of the era. And this portrait guy says, I'd really like to paint you. And as he's painting him, he falls in love with Dorian Gray. And he paints this incredibly exquisite portrait of Dorian. And of course, just like normally, Dorian doesn't see the portrait until it's ready. And on the final sitting, the painter has a friend with him. And this friend is an older guy, you know, quite a wise guy. And before Dorian looks at the painting, he says, hang on a minute. You need to understand that this is your most beautiful moment in life. You know, one day you'll be like me, you'll be old and, you know, ugly and whatever else. And Dorian's like, okay. And then he looks at the painting and it's so exquisite. He essentially has an existential crisis and he breaks down and he says, if only the painting could grow old and ugly instead of me, I would give my soul for that. And of course, the book is about him giving his soul for that. And what happens is he is someone who does, as all of us do, bad things to other people, right? We're nasty, we're jealous, all those things. And he starts to notice as he does these things that the painting is getting uglier. And he's really frightened by this dynamic. So he takes the portrait and he locks it in the attic of his house. And at the beginning, he's kind of tortured by it, but then he really pushes it out of his consciousness and really deceives himself that this does not exist. I'm not going to spoil the end of the book. It's rather dramatic. And then something happens. It's not good how it ends. But of course, we all do this, right? We all have the portrait in the back of our mind that we are not going to look at because it holds the ugly things, the things we're ashamed of. But what we do psychologically is they are the things that we attribute to the other group that we're polarizing. And so it's very easy for me to say, they're the ideological people, you know, they want to dominate. But of course, there's a little piece of me that wants that as well. So I think this portrait of Dorian Gray is a really good reminder that we're all the problem, but we can all be the solution. So I've been told to Nazia, I've got to stick to 30 minutes. I think I'm just at 30 minutes, Nazia. I think I hand back to you at this point, right? And then I'm going to take some Q&As. So yeah. I'm going to grab my glasses because they're tiny.
Exactly, Jen. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I was literally glued to the screen there, and I see that the chat has been going, pretty wild over here. So we've got lots of comments in the chat. So I'm excited to get started. And now we have an opportunity. We do have a lot of questions. We have, in fact, a whole series of questions. I believe some of the questions have been answered, but Jen, was there any particular questions?
Yeah, so I'm going to go through as many as I can. So I'm going to say I'm struggling with middle-aged eyesight. And I can read the chat a lot better than the Q&A. I know we said we'd use the Q&A. I'm going to do my best. So I'm going to try with the Q&A first, and then I'll pop to the chat. But I'm just going to say there's some comments in the chat, which I can see very big. It's not just, there are other benefits to reading literature. Oh, it's because it's pleasure, right? It's the best thing to do. Thank you, Aideen. Okay, so Lydia Khan. So there's this question of, right, despite overwhelming evidence, diverse teams have higher financial innovation results, people aren't still doing it. So first, there is not evidence. That I want to be very clear. And if you were on the webinar a couple of weeks ago with my colleague Svenja Weber, she will share that it is a myth that the more diverse the team, the higher results. What happens is it's more complicated than that. So when you have a homogeneous team, you tend to get decent results, but you never get breakthrough results. When you have a heterogeneous or a diverse team, the span of possible results change. So it's the only case you're going to get breakthrough results with a diverse team. You can also get really poor results. So it increases the variance and it increases the upper edge. Now, of course, the question for us is what makes the difference, right? And what makes the difference is exactly what we've been talking about today, is this ability to work across differences. So simply feeding into an organization more diverse hires alone is not going to solve the problem. Now, I'm a great advocate of hiring diverse people, but that alone is not the answer at all. And in fact, what we see, and many of you will have experienced this personally, right? You get hired because we need a woman, or we need someone from this nationality or from this racial, but then you walk into a culture which is toxic. And lo and behold, you leave 6 months later. So it's really important that the leadership culture is going to support connecting across differences, because otherwise just hiring diversity is kind of useless. Okay, reading is hard for me. Yeah, can I watch telly? Can I watch films? I think there are a few questions about this. There's nothing wrong with watching films. It's enjoyable. The research says clearly it doesn't have the same effect. And it's really about, the reason behind this is how hard your brain needs to work. You know, film is, for your brain, a film is lazy, right? Your brain can just kind of consume. Oh, this is a good metaphor, actually. A film you consume, a book consumes you. And it's that act of being consumed and having to work and think about what does this character look like and what does this thing look like, which is the thing that really creates this effect. So I'm not saying don't watch films. It's great when we're exhausted, but the science shows it doesn't have exactly the same effects. That's not to say it doesn't have any effect. We can certainly learn a lot about other cultures and things like this, but this effect of humanizing the other isn't so strong with films. And part of that reason is what we get from a book, which we don't get from a film, is what we would technically is called interiority, but we get the inner dialogue. So if you think about reading a book, especially when it's written in the first person, the character will like speak to themselves, and we hear that inner world, how they're making sense of the world. So that book I recommended on the neurodivergent book is brilliant for that. And you're like, oh my goodness, I never imagined someone would think like that. You just don't get that with film. But there's nothing wrong with watching film for relax, but it doesn't have the same effect. So Roberta, I prefer reading real stories than fiction. I love nonfiction as well. I love autobiographies. It doesn't quite have this, of course you can learn a lot. It doesn't quite have the same effect for a couple of reasons. One is there's a certain type of person tends to write or autobiographies or memoirs, and they tend to be pretty successful people or people who've had very extraordinary things happen to them, which, let's be honest, is not most of us. So it's a very skewed sample. Also, people filter naturally. If I'm telling the story of my life, I'm going to leave out the picture of Dorian Gray. Right? Whereas novelists are pretty harsh on the characters. They include the portrait of Dorian Gray. So again, it's a great supplemental thing to do, not knocking it. I do it a lot. It doesn't quite have exactly the same effects for those reasons. But I certainly wouldn't say don't read those books. I think they're really enlightening. But in terms of what we've been talking today, it's not exactly the same effects. Okay, I think I've handled. Okay, I'm going to go to the chat because I can actually read them. This isn't a question. Yeah, so can we elaborate on concrete steps for leadership development? Obviously, there's as we say in England, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So I'm not suggesting that reading fiction is the absolute first most important thing to do and the only thing you should do. But what I'm saying is it's an area that we've overlooked. And it's an area that has a lot of research behind it that shows very powerful effects. And it's something that's pretty cheap. And it's something that's enjoyable. and it's something that, you know, any of us can do. There are, of course, other ways to get this effect. But what we find scientifically is these things take time. And time and energy of investment is something that's very scarce in organizations. So for example, and now I'm going to shamelessly plug some INSEAD programs, so forgive me. I mean, one of the things we do at INSEAD, and one of the reasons we insist people come on campus, is we kind of cocoon them and we really give them a lot of time to reflect on these things. So for example, I will never do a program that's less than 4 days because I just know I'm feeding people popcorn otherwise, right? I want to get these big change effects and it takes time. So of course there's other ways of doing it. So one of the things I was talking about, so we have a partnership with Wharton, and I was talking to the Dean of Wharton when I was in the US the other day, and we were talking about designing a program where we took people to the Abrahamic family house and really talked about these dynamics and showed them. Of course, there are other ways of doing it, but the reason I wanted to lift this up is I just think it's a very cool way that we don't think about, that's cheap, that, you know, people can do on their own. People like different readings. Okay, there's a lot of questions about the younger generation and how we can get younger people to read. And this is where I'm going to tell you now, me too, we are ageist. So the people who read the most at the moment fiction are the 15 to 25-year-olds. So the biggest hashtag on I'm not on TikTok. The biggest hashtag on TikTok is called BookTok. And it's these 15 to 25-year-olds who devour these books and books and books every single week and then review them on TikTok. So we are making a mistake when we are thinking this is a younger generation problem. What we're seeing is, in fact, the biggest uptick in reading is among the younger generation. And in fact, it's for those of you who are interested in the publishing industry, and if anyone from the publishing industry on me, it's turning the publishing industry completely on its head because these people are devouring books. And I can tell you, as a mother of 2 late teenagers, I mean, the budget for books in our house is very high. And a lot of it is driven by TikTok. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful with the younger generation. And this summer, I was also like, I'm a little bit snobby when it comes to books, I'll be honest. I was thinking, oh my, what are they reading? So this summer, I said to my daughter, okay, I want to read some of the books you're reading. And of course, they were slightly trashy, but they were brilliant of getting into characters and really understanding. And a lot of them are these dystopian fiction, which is all about polarization, right? Which is all about the two groups fighting against each other. So I think the young people are leading the way right now on this. Lots of book recommendations in the chat. Which is great. Yeah, audiobooks, really good alternative. Yeah, okay, Afreen, what strategies, this is a more kind of thing, what strategies can we create to create inclusion in the workplace? So Nazia, I don't know, do they get access to the Svenja's webinar? I can see you, do you want to nod? Can you nod or not nod?
Yeah, I was going to say, so there is they'll need to go on to the link to access it, but we could see if that can be made available. Yeah, there is a...
Yeah, so there was a big webinar on this 2 weeks ago, so I don't want to double up on that, but there's lots of resources, especially on INSEAD Knowledge.
Send me an email and I can share the link to that webinar.
Thanks, Nazia. Thank you. Yeah, okay, so do we have scientific papers on how art in general helps develop empathy and intellectual abilities? I'm not sure about our intellectual abilities, but we do know there is a very strong connection between art in general, whether it's painting, sculpture, whatever, and mental health and stress levels. Obviously, the more you do, the less stressed and kind of the less mental health issues you have. But we also know that it's a really good way of getting our brains to engage in a very different way. So I'm sure many of you are like me, trained in kind of maths, sciences, engineering, very kind of rational way of thinking about the world. But you're leaders of organizations, you don't need to tell me the world is not rational. And I think many of the quote unquote bad decisions we make in organizations, the decisions which go wrong, is because we have approached what are essentially humanistic problems with too rational a mind. Like, if I do X, then Y will happen. And so what we know that engaging with art in general can do, whether it's fiction, whether it's painting, sculptures, music, is really engage that more subjective piece of our brain, that more holistic piece of our brain that is good at making patterns as opposed to correlation. So if we think of like X leads to Y as opposed to patterning. And if we think about human behavior, which most issues in organizations are around human behavior, this is all about patterning. It's not about X leads to Y, because there's almost nothing out there that if I do the same thing to all of you, you will all react in the same way. I mean, we know this to be false, yet our training kind of pushes us in this direction. So I think when we think about solving people issues, we think, you know, I pull this lever and this is going to happen, which really doesn't. So I hope that happens. Oh yeah, Sarah has this recommendation of novelist Elif Shafak, one of my favorite writers. How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. A great book, great recommendations. Nazia, it would be great if you could pull all the book recommendations from the chat when we finish and send them out to people. Yeah. That would be great. Okay, Anastasia, what would be your suggestions of bringing inclusion journey teams, people that are not as engaged as in the dominant groups? So there's lots of recommendations here, but I'm going to start with what we need to do ourselves, because I think this comes back to the portrait of Dorian Gray. I think we make a lot of assumptions about the other, right? So what I see at the moment, I'm going to tell you a story from the conference. We were at the conference last week, and it was a conference I organized with the Dean of Wharton and a colleague from Boston College. And this colleague from Boston College, senior guy, a really important mentor for me, but you know, classic guy who gets beaten up on now, older white guy. And we were sort of sat through these sessions talking about these things. And after one session, which was particularly kind of beating up these people, I said to him, I said, how are you feeling, Mike? And he's like, I feel like my identity is the only one that is socially acceptable to beat up on. Now we can debate that was what he was feeling, right, in himself. And I do think we are very good at looking at other groups and assuming they don't want to engage, or they're not interested, or they never accept this, or like, oh, I never get these guys to read fiction. And I would just start from is that really true? Is that really true? Or is it about how you're presenting it and how you're framing it? So I'm very much a fan of, what is my piece in this? And what can I do to kind of shift that to get them engaged, rather than, so I hope that helps. Yes, Ilias, does the metaphor of the hero's journey in the narrative of books or films serve today's challenges? Yeah, I think it does at a psychological level. So for those of you who don't know the metaphor of the hero's journey, this is work by someone called Campbell, and I've just forgotten his first name, so I'm not very good with names. Someone remind me what his first name is. Anyway, Campbell. And he was a comparative anthropologist. And he took stories from across the world, from across world cultures, and really pulled out the common elements in them. And one of the common elements was this idea of the hero's journey, which takes different forms, but is essentially like, there's kind of a quest, there's something that needs to get done. Think The Hobbit or something like this, right? It's a classic, or Harry Potter, right? It's like something needs to be defeated. I go out, I meet mentors along the way. I come around. So yes, I think it is. I think the thing that worries me about the hero's journey is it's very individualistic. And I think we gotta do this collectively. So I think there needs to be some work at, right, what does that look like at a collective level? But yeah, I think it's a really important metaphor that we need to be thinking of. Okay, I'm going to scroll to the bottom of the chat and get some of the most recent questions. And Nazia, if you see any interesting ones, shout out as well.
So we did have one, Jen, that was here, but I think you sort of answered it. Maybe you can just elaborate a bit on what you've mentioned there. There's a question here. Working in a diverse global company where people come from different nationalities, I observe the implicit polarization amongst my colleagues quite often. Even if I'm not affected, how to influence my colleagues to refrain from such a thought or process? I thought that was a really interesting question because it's almost casting a question on they've identified themselves not being in this bracket and how can they support others? So any advice to share there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Also, Joseph Campbell, thank you for everyone who reminded me, Joseph Campbell. It's a great question. So I guess I have two things to say to this. I think first, it's really important we speak up and say things. And now there's a question, how do you do that, right? I'm not suggesting you point the finger and say, you're polarizing the other. But I think it's about challenging the assumptions, right? Is that do you have data for that assumption? Can you give me examples? And I think that question, can you give me examples, is really powerful, because I find more often than not, people are like, oh, well, and that's data in and of itself, right? Challenging them. I would also push back, if I may, a little bit. And Nazia, this is maybe how you said the question rather than how the person phrased the question. But it is so easy to think we are not part of the problem. It's just so easy. And I understand the desire to feel we're one of the good ones, but we're not, right? We also have blind spots. We also have the portrait in our mind. And I think what can be really powerful, especially if you're in a senior leadership position, is really to own that shadow, right? To own that portrait. And I'm not talking about, oh, I had this failure and this is what happened. I'm really talking about, actually, these are my blind spots. These are the groups that drive me absolutely bonkers. So one exercise I often think about this is, you can do this all now. Think of the public figure who riles you up the most. So not just someone you disagree with or dislike, but when this public figure comes on TV, you're like, oh. The likelihood is the reason it's that person, there's all sorts of people who could do this to you, but I want you to think of the person who most drives you, like you kind of would like to strangle them. You wouldn't, but you kind of think, I would love to strangle that person. Almost certainly the characteristics that drive you bonkers about that person are characteristics that you're fighting against in yourself. You don't want to agree with it. So I'll give you a personal example. I'm not going to name the person because we all have different people. There's a certain politician who's really ideological and a different ideology for me. And every time he comes on TV, I just can't watch the TV. I just cannot take him. And I was talking to a very close friend in Boston. We were walking along by the river on Saturday, and I was like, when this guy comes on TV, I cannot take him. And she was like, oh, well, you've got a little X, his name, in the back of your head. And I was like, oh. And of course it's true, right? I would love to think I'm not ideological and very pragmatic. Of course I am. I have a very different ideology. And yet I would love to stamp my ideology on everyone else. I would love to force every single person to get electric cars and all this sort of stuff. But I kind of push that away and I see it in someone else. So it's just a kind of plea to really think about how we are part of the problem, because I'm never going to change this guy, but I can change how I react to these people. And if we all did that work, then the problem would go away. But I think with other people, this kind of naming it, asking for examples, challenging assumptions in a gentle way is really helpful.
Thanks.
I would also say my last thing is a plea to not stick within your group. I think the tendency at the moment is to say, okay, even in the lunchroom, I'm going to go and sit with these people because I feel most comfortable with them. This is really dangerous. And I see this happening in organizations. I see this happening in society. Like, I'm just not going to talk to these people because they annoy me so much. That's the beginning of the end.
Thank you, Jen. I think that was a brilliant answer. And yeah, the question was raised for that reason. I thought it would be a good talking point. And I think you've given some insights to the person that asked the question as well. So we are a minute away from being at the end of the webinar. And I thought that was a really nice place to say, one, thank you so, so much to you for, honestly, the topic has blown everyone's mind. You can see claps and hearts and reactions. I think everyone has loved the session today on reading between the lines. Thank you to everyone that's joined. You've been very engaging. There's lots more questions. We couldn't answer everything today. So please do find ways to connect with us, and we'll stay connected and give you more insights. We won't have much more time for questions and answers today, but some great reactions. I think let's just say a big thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
We're reaching the end of our webinar. I'm saying good evening on my side here in Singapore. I think it's almost lunchtime for you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone. Wishing you a great afternoon, evening, or morning ahead. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.